Chapter 1. It all starts with a cane. The bustling city intersection was filled with the hum of traffic and the murmur of voices. The air was thick with tension, that strange electric feeling that foretells trouble. Officer Ray Cross stood by his cruiser like a predator watching for prey. His narrow eyes were suspicious, his lips pressed tightly together. He hated his shift at this station. Too many odd people, too many things that irritated him. And then he saw him. An old man, walking slowly across the street, leaning on an elegant, dark wood cane. He was dressed too smartly for the area, a sharp suit, polished shoes, a proud bearing. But Ray saw only one thing, his skin color. Something inside him boiled, covering his mind with a wave of dull anger. "Hey, you!" Cross shouted, his voice cutting through the street noise like a knife. "Come here!" The old man froze, turned around and looked calmly at the officer. His eyes were deep and calm, but this only angered Cross even more. There was something in that look that he hated, indifference to his authority, an unwillingness to obey. "I said come here," Cross repeated, already taking a step forward. "What's that you've got?" He nodded at his cane. "Give it to me before I find a reason to arrest you." The old man shook his head slowly, his lips twitching slightly in a half-smile. It wasn't a protest, not a challenge, but some kind of quiet reminder of something greater. But it infuriated Cross. He snatched his cane with such force that the old man staggered. "That's all I wanted," Cross muttered, clutching the cane like a trophy. "You don't really need it, do you? Now get out of here." But the old man did not move. His voice, low and confident, cut through the air. "Officer Cross, you've just deprived me not just of my cane, but of my support. Now think about how you're going to explain your behavior to your new superior." Cross froze, the world around him narrowing to those words and the slow realization that the old man wasn't joking. Chapter 2. The Weight of History. Cross froze. The old man's words were drowned out by the roar of his own pulse, but their meaning came crashing down like an avalanche. Chaos flared up inside him, fear, anger, an attempt to find some way out of the situation. He still held his cane tightly, as if it were the only thing that connected him to the power he had grown accustomed to feeling in this city. "You don't understand," Cross whispered, but the old man didn't let him finish. "Oh, I understand." The old man's voice was cold, almost icy. "I understand it all too well. Your look, your actions, that cane in your hand, it's all familiar to me. Do you think this is the first time you've taken something from a man who's not like you? Number? It's an old story, officer. A story you continue without even thinking about it. A story written in pain and humiliation you don't even try to see." The old man took another step forward. Their faces were so close now that Cross could see every wrinkle on his face, lines carved by decades of fighting. His eyes reflected the hundreds of years of bitterness that had preceded this moment. "You know what's most terrifying?" the old man continued, his voice growing quieter, but even sharper. "It's not just an insult, it's a memory. Every time someone like you thinks they're above others, you bring forth shadows. Shadows of those who stood on this same street, humiliated, beaten, stripped of their dignity. You're an extension of the chain." Cross felt his breath become ragged. Something about those words turned everything inside him upside down. He wanted to scream, to say that it wasn't his fault, that he had been trained to be tough, that he was just doing his job. But the words stuck in his throat until the old man took a step back, pointing at his cane. "Give it back to me," he said quietly, but there was a note of judgment in his voice. "It's not just a cane, it's a memory. It's what you're trying to take away." Cross hesitantly raised his hand, holding out his cane. It suddenly seemed to him that it was not just an object, but a burden, too heavy to hold. But when the old man took it, there was no lightness. On the contrary, it increased the heaviness in his soul. "You think it's over?" The old man looked at him, turning to leave. Number, "This is just the beginning." Cross watched him go, bitterness rising in his throat. He suddenly realized he couldn't erase this moment, couldn't hide from it. This old man wasn't just a man, not just a new boss. He was the embodiment of something bigger, something Cross had spent his whole life turning away from. Chapter 3: Humiliation Under the Weight of the Past. The street, noisy a moment ago, suddenly seemed deadly quiet. Officer Cross stood there stunned, but the old man had not gone far. He stopped, looking over his shoulder, and his gaze was like a blade piercing the very soul. "You do think this cane is just an object, don't you?" he asked. His voice was even, but with each word the tension in the air grew. "But to me, it is a symbol. It is my dignity, which you tried to take away, like so many before you." The crowd around him grew quieter. People were listening. They were seeing more than just an argument. They were seeing an old, deep wound that had opened up right there, before their eyes. And Cross felt the gazes of the passers-by burning through him. But all he could do was stand there, humiliated and confused. "How dare you talk about dignity?" Cross's voice wavered as he tried to force something out to regain control. "I was just doing my job." The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in his smile. It was bitter, like the morning frost. "Work? This is your work?" He took a step closer, raising his cane as if pointing at Cross himself. "Work is to protect people, not to humiliate them. Do you think I haven't seen your kind? Over the years, I've learned to recognize your look. That look that says, you are nothing, you are no one. I heard your tone. You say it's just work, but the truth is, it's your excuse. An excuse for being the bearer of pain." The crowd began to murmur. Some looked at Cross with disapproval, others with silent contempt. But the old man was not finished. "You know, officer," he continued, his voice growing louder, filling the space, "I've seen people like you use their badges not for protection, but for power. Power over those who can't fight back. And you know what's scary? Every time you think it's over, that pain comes back, because it can't be hidden. It stays with us." Cross wanted to say something, wanted this torture to stop, but he couldn't. His own actions, the rudeness, the insolence, the hatred he didn't even try to hide, came back to him like an echo. The old man took another step, now very close. His eyes, dark and stern, met Cross's. "I remember those who were beaten, humiliated, made to feel worthless. I remember my brothers being taken away in patrol cars and never coming back. I remember my father being humiliated when he just wanted to be a free man. I see in you each of those who stood with that look. That look is not new. It is the look of a man who is afraid. Afraid that his world will collapse if he accepts us as equals." The crowd had now formed a tight circle around them. Cross felt a lump rising in his throat. The old man's words hit him harder than he thought possible. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his own confidence. "I tried to give you a chance," the old man said quietly, stepping back. "But you showed who you are, and do you know what's going to happen next?" The words hung in the air, heavy as thunderclouds. Cross didn't know the answer. He just stood there, consumed by fear, shame, and something he couldn't even describe. The weight of the past he'd ignored for so long suddenly fell on him like hail. The old man turned, leaving him in the crowd's gaze. Cross heard the whispers around him, feeling his world crumble. The cane in the old man's hands hit the asphalt, a clear, confident sound that echoed in his mind. Chapter 4: The Face of Hate. The air around him grew stifling. The air, thick with the whispers of the crowd and the heavy silence, seemed to weigh down on Cross's shoulders. He felt like a cornered animal, trapped in his own ignorance. The old man walked away slowly, but every step he took seemed to echo in Cross's mind like a funeral march. "This isn't the end," Cross shouted, taking a step forward, but his voice sounded uncertain, as if he was trying to convince himself. "You can't just leave like this. You provoked me. You forced me to do this." The old man stopped. His shoulders remained motionless, but the cane on which he leaned froze in mid-air for a moment. He turned slowly, his gaze sharp as a dagger. Provoked? His voice was quiet, but this silence was more terrible than a scream. Provoked you with what? By just standing there? By walking down the street, where you don't think I belong? You don't see me as a person, but as a threat. It's not me who provokes you, officer. It's your hatred, your anger that lives inside you like poison, and you let it guide your actions. Cross felt his face heat up. The crowd around him were no longer just silent observers. They were eyes now, judging, despising him. He wanted to find some support, some way out, but the old man's words were growing louder, like drums beating. You think you can hide this? The old man continued, taking a step forward. But your actions say more than you realize. This is not just a mistake, officer. This is a story that has been going on for centuries, a story in which you have chosen to become the next chapter. He slowly raised his cane, showing it to the crowd. His hand shook slightly, but his voice remained firm. This cane belonged to my father. He was a doctor who treated hundreds of people, but he was forced to stand at the end of the line because his skin was the wrong color. He carried this cane when he was beaten for daring to open a clinic for people like him. And now you, he pointed the cane at Cross, daring to take it away from me. What is this, if not a continuation of the same hatred? Cross clenched his fists, feeling rage battle with fear. Protest was boiling inside him. He wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, but every attempt to find words was shattered by the old man's stony certainty. Enough of this talk, he shouted, taking a step forward. You don't know what I've been through. Every day I go out on the streets where I'm hated, where I have to fight for order. And you come here and turn everything into a race. The old man smiled again, but it was not a triumphant smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen too much pain to be surprised by new pain. Race? He said quietly, and his voice suddenly sounded tired. I'm not the one making this a race issue, officer. You are. You made the choice to approach me. You decided that my cane was a threat. You decided that I didn't deserve respect. And you continue to justify your actions even when the whole world can see that you're wrong. The crowd stirred. Whispers began. Some people took out their phones, filming everything that was happening. Cross felt the walls of his confidence crumbling. He could no longer see a way out. All these people, these cameras, this old man, they all seemed like a single accusing voice that was loudly ringing in his head. I'll tell you one thing, the old man said, taking a final step forward. They were now face to face, and his voice was almost a whisper, but it seemed louder than any shout. Your hatred is your chain. It keeps you in place, preventing you from moving forward. Do you want to be strong? Then let it go. Or you'll remain the same, a man remembered only for his rudeness and humiliation. Cross turned away. He could no longer look the man in the eye. The weight of the words was like a mountain. It felt like the whole world was watching him fall, and that fall was inevitable. Chapter 5. On the Edge. The old man turned away, and the movement, calm, confident, seemed to explode in Raycross's head, causing a flash of anger so strong that he could not control it. All those looks from the crowd, all the words thrown at him, turned into one thing: his weakness. The weakness he hated most of all. He, an officer, was supposed to be a symbol of strength, but at that moment he felt naked in front of every passerby, in front of every camera lens, in front of this old man. I'm not done yet, Cross barked, lunging forward so hard that the old man froze and the crowd gasped. You think you can lecture me on how I should do my job? You think you can just walk away after you humiliated me in front of these people? Who the hell are you to tell me about hate? I'm the law, and I'm going to tell you what you did wrong. The old man didn't move. His calmness added fuel to Cross's rage. The cop felt his words ripping out of his chest, heavy and dirty, but he couldn't stop. You're a nobody, he continued, anger dripping from his tongue like poison. You're just another one who thinks he can walk around here and tell me I'm doing something wrong. You think you're important because you wear that suit? Because you have that cane? No, you're just trying to seem superior. But we all know who you are. You're all the same. All of you." The words hung in the air like thunder, and Cross felt the crowd tense. Several people took a step back, others began filming even more actively, their cameras capturing his every move. But he no longer saw them. All his attention was focused on the old man, who looked at him with unwavering confidence. "You speak of the law?" the old man finally answered, his voice low but so loud it seemed to echo down the street. "The law is justice. The law is protection. But you have turned it into a weapon against those you do not like, against those who are not like you. You do not represent the law, officer. You represent hatred dressed in a uniform." The words hit Cross like lightning, but he couldn't acknowledge it. He was too consumed by his anger, too caught up in the feeling of losing control. He stepped closer, so close that he could smell the faint scent of tobacco on the old man's suit. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed, his face twisted in anger. "Because you can talk nicely? Because these people are on your side? Listen to me. You're not better. You're just an old man trying to play the victim so he can get what he wants. That's all you know how to do. Live off people like me." The old man listened silently, but his gaze remained as piercing as ever. It drove Cross crazy. He wanted him to break, to show weakness, to admit he was right just once. But instead, the old man spoke again. "You know, officer, I've seen people like you all my life. People who cling to hatred like it's a lifeline. Because if they let it go, they'll be left with nothing. Hatred is all you have, isn't it? It makes you strong, because without it, you're nothing. You fear it, more than anything." The words exploded in Cross's mind. He grabbed the old man's shoulder, squeezing it so hard his knuckles turned white. The crowd stirred, shouting, "Leave him alone!" Logically, "What are you doing?" But Cross didn't care. He wanted to shut the man up, make him see who was boss. "You have no idea who I am," he said through clenched teeth, his face so close to the old man's they could feel each other's breath. "You think you can humiliate me? But the truth is, you're the one who's nothing here. You and everyone who supports you. You're just—" The old man interrupted him without raising his voice, but his words came like a bolt from the blue. "You think you're strong? But your strength is based on fear, and that fear is your only legacy. You can break me, you can humiliate me, but you will never win. Because hate never wins. It only destroys." The words hung in the air. Cross felt the ground shift beneath him. His grip weakened. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were judging. Every look was a sentence, and he knew that with that moment, his world had changed forever. Chapter 6: Shadow of the Past. The crowd was frozen in tense anticipation, as if the scene were being played out on a theater stage where no one dared breathe, lest the delicate balance be upset. Officer Cross, squeezing the old man's shoulder, felt a strange sensation. It was not he who was in control. It was the old man himself, despite his apparent vulnerability, who was in control of the moment. Ray didn't understand why. He was the law here. He had the power, the badge, the gun. But at that moment, all those symbols seemed powerless against one man who did not even raise his voice. The old man stepped back slightly and looked at Cross with something that might have been pity, but there was more behind the mask. His face, lined like a time map, held a secret the officer could not read. This man knew something that no one else in the room knew. "You don't understand," the old man finally said, his voice as low as distant thunder. "Your actions today aren't just your choices. They're part of something bigger, something you don't even recognize. You think you're in control, but in reality, you're just a tool. A tool used by a system designed to break people like me." Cross couldn't help but laugh, though it was more of a growl. He released the old man's shoulder, taking a step back and looking around the crowd. People were looking at him, some with disapproval, others with apprehension, but there was something else in those looks, something he couldn't decipher. "A tool?" Cross said dismissively, a sardonic smile plastered on his face. "Are you trying to tell me I'm a victim? No, man, you're the victim. You've been playing that role your whole life. You and everyone like you have done nothing but blame others for your problems. It's your system, not mine. I'm just doing my job." The old man smiled again, but there was something unnatural about it. It seemed he knew something that no one else around him knew. "You think you see the truth, but you haven't even scratched the surface," he said, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "You think you own this place. You think you're in charge. But let me ask you one question, officer. How long have you been a part of this street? How long have you lived here?" Cross frowned, his confidence beginning to crack. Something in the old man's tone threw him off balance. He hadn't expected to hear such a question. "I've been here for 5 years," he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "And this is my area. I know every street, every house. And I know people like you." "Like me?" the old man asked, tilting his head slightly. "But you know nothing about me. Nothing. You see only what you want to see. Skin color, age, cane. But you don't see the truth. You don't see that I'm standing here for a reason. Do you think I'm a random passerby? No, officer, I'm here for a reason, and that reason is closely tied to you." Cross tensed. Something in the old man's words made his heart beat faster. The phrases were like blows, each one shattering his confidence into tiny pieces. He tried to understand what the man meant, but he couldn't. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're just an old curmudgeon trying to make a scene. You think you can scare me? You won't." The old man did not answer at once. He leaned on his cane, straightening up, and his gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, as if he saw something that was hidden from the others. "Are you sure you know who you are?" he asked finally, his voice strangely distant. "Are you sure this place is yours? Because if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that your story is just part of a bigger story, a story that began long before you. And you're not the hero of that story. You're its shadow." The crowd froze, and even the noise of the city seemed to have died down. People looked at the old man, then at Cross, and then back at the old man. Something in his words suddenly made the whole thing seem deeper and more mysterious than just an argument on the street. Cross felt something cold slide down his spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't. His thoughts were muddled, as if he had suddenly found himself in a fog he couldn't clear. "What do you mean?" he finally managed. His voice was weak, not like before. The old man looked at him, and there was a spark of something in his eyes that Cross couldn't quite place. It wasn't contempt, it wasn't anger. It was some ancient, eternal force that he couldn't name. "You'll find out, officer," the old man said, his voice almost a whisper, but it sounded like it was in the minds of everyone standing nearby. "You'll find out soon. And then you'll understand that it's not always the man wearing the badge who's the law. Sometimes it's just the man hiding behind it." And with that, he turned and walked slowly away, leaving Cross standing there, as if paralyzed. The crowd dispersed, but the whispers continued. People were discussing what they had seen, but for Cross, this moment was something more. He felt that everything had changed. Something deep and disturbing was beginning to grow in his soul. Chapter 7. Facing the truth night had caught the city by surprise. The rain had washed away the last of the day's heat, leaving behind a heavy, damp silence. Officer Ray Cross sat in his cruiser, barely noticing the raindrops running down the glass. He thought he could hear his own breathing, heavy as a crashing wave. He couldn't get the old man out of his mind, his words, his look, his unwavering certainty, as if he knew something even Cross didn't know. The car was stuffy, but Ray didn't open the window. He sat staring at a spot on the dashboard, lost in thought. "You'll find out. You'll find out soon." The words played over and over in his head like a broken record. But what exactly was he supposed to find out? And why was this old man he'd humiliated in front of a crowd so confident in challenging him? Ray shook his head, trying to clear the intrusive thoughts, but they came back, more insistent. He needed to do something to relieve the tension, to regain control. He glanced at his wristwatch, almost midnight. His shift had ended an hour ago, but he still couldn't bring himself to go home. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Ray pulled it out, and the screen lit up with a short notification, a message from Lieutenant Brady. "Cross, come down to the station. We need to talk urgently." The text was short, but it was strange. The lieutenant had never called him this late. Ray's heart began to beat faster, but he decided not to show his anxiety even to himself. He quickly typed a response. "On my way." 20 minutes later, he was standing in front of the police department. The rain had gotten heavier, dripping down his uniform as he crossed the parking lot. The lights inside the building were dim. Most of the offices were empty, and only the officer at the desk glanced at him briefly. "The lieutenant is waiting for you in the conference room," he said, without even looking up from the monitor. Ray walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing. The conference room was lit with an oddly dim light. Lieutenant Brady sat at a long table, and next to him was the old man. Ray stopped, his breathing quickening. He felt his legs go weak, his throat go dry. "Come on in, Cross," Brady said, not looking up from the papers laid out in front of him. His voice was calm, but something about it made Ray tense up even more. "What is he doing here?" Ray asked, trying to regain his usual confident tone, but his voice betrayed him. The old man sat motionless, his hands folded on his cane, his gaze fixed on Ray. There was the same piercing certainty in that gaze that had unsettled Cross earlier in the day. Brady said, leaning back in his chair, "This is your new boss." The words hit Ray like a bullet. He froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. "What?" he whispered, and then louder, "What the hell is this joke?" "This is no joke," the old man said, his voice soft but commanding. "My name is James Walker. I am the new head of the department, as of today." Cross felt the world around him begin to crumble. He tried to speak, to find an excuse, but the words were stuck in his throat. All his behavior during the day, all his insults, humiliations, rudeness, all of it now floated before him like a black ghost. It's impossible," he muttered, taking a step back. You didn't say anything. You just stood there." "I didn't have to say anything," Walker said calmly. "This was your chance to prove yourself, to show who you really are. And you did." Ray felt his throat tighten like a noose. He wanted to defend himself, to justify himself, but instead he only remained silent. An oppressive silence hung in the room. "You think the law is just a badge and a uniform?" Walker continued, his voice growing harder. "The law is justice. It's what I've spent my life protecting. But today, I saw you use it as a weapon against those you don't think deserve respect." Brady watched the exchange silently, his face serious, but there was something more in his eyes, disappointment perhaps. "Cross," he finally said, "your actions this afternoon, it wasn't just an incident. It was an indication that you don't understand what it means to serve the law. Walker could ask for your dismissal right now, and I would support him." Ray clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. He was on edge. Everything he knew, all his confidence, all of it was gone in a matter of minutes. He began, but Walker interrupted him. "You can still change your story," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "But that means acknowledging who you were and becoming someone else. The question is, are you willing to do that?" Cross stood in silence. The rain continued to pound the windows, and his reflection in the glass looked alien. Chapter 8. The Collapse of Confidence. The room had gone so quiet that Ray Cross could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The gaze of his new boss, James Walker, was like an X-ray, penetrating the deepest parts of his soul, where fear and doubt and shadow lurked. Only a few hours ago he had felt at the height of his power, confident, strong, in control of every moment. But now it had all evaporated, like fog in a blazing sun. His confidence no longer protected him. It was a fragile illusion. "You're silent, Officer Cross," Walker said, his voice soft but steely. "Is it because you're beginning to understand? Or is it because you've run out of excuses?" Ray wanted to answer. wanted to shout something in his defense, but the words wouldn't come. He suddenly felt small, insignificant, lost in this room where even the walls seemed to condemn him. His palms were sticky with sweat. He tried to discreetly wipe them on his pants, but the movement did not escape Walker's attention. He raised an eyebrow slightly, as if to emphasize how Cross was losing the last of his dignity with each passing moment. I was just doing my job, he finally managed, his voice weak, almost a whisper. It sounded so pathetic that even Cross felt like a stranger to himself. You were doing your job? Walker asked, his tone sharpening. No, officer, you weren't doing your job. You were playing the master. You thought you had the right to humiliate me, a man who had done nothing wrong. You thought your position gave you power. But you know what I see right now? I see a man who is afraid of being held accountable for his actions. The words hit Ray like a hammer. He felt a cold sweat run down his back. Everything in him protested the accusations, but he couldn't deny that every word Walker said was true. Fear grew inside him, filling his chest, making it hard to breathe. He no longer felt like the man in control. He felt like a child caught stealing, with no way to defend himself. I'm not what you think, he managed to say, but the words sounded pathetic even to him. He knew they were empty. He knew they wouldn't change anything. Walker bowed his head, looking at him with an expression that mixed weariness and regret. You're not like that, he repeated. Then tell me, why did you decide I was a threat in the first place? Why did you snatch the cane from me? Why didn't you ask yourself what kind of man stood before you humiliated me in front of the crowd? Cross opened his mouth to respond, but again found no words. All he could do was stand there, paralyzed, feeling like the walls of the room were closing in on him, turning him into a cage. You think I don't know how you see people like me? Walker continued, his voice calm but powerful. To you, I'm just a color, just an age, just a person who doesn't deserve your respect. And you know what's scary about it, officer? You're not alone. You're part of the problem that permeates this department, this city, this country. Walker's words cut like a knife. Cross felt the fear growing inside him, like rust eating away at him from the inside. He tried to find something to cling to, but there was nothing. Even his badge, a symbol of power and strength, seemed like an empty trinket now. What happens now? He finally managed to squeeze out, unable to bear the silence any longer. His voice was weak, almost pleading. He was no longer the confident officer who had looked down on the old man in the street. He was now simply a man broken by his own actions. Walker leaned forward slightly, leaning on his cane. There was no anger or contempt in his eyes, only the weight of years and the bitterness of having seen this too often. It's up to you now, officer, he said quietly. You can walk away from here pretending nothing happened. You can convince yourself you're innocent, but remember, it won't erase what you did. It won't change who you are. The words hung in the air, and Ray felt his chest tighten even more. He had no answer. He had no way out. He was backed into a corner, with nothing left but his own mistakes. Chapter 9. The Cage of Fear. Ray Cross walked out of the conference room, feeling the walls of the station close in around him. The air felt thick and sticky, as if an invisible force was trying to hold him in place. His head was spinning, and his feet felt like strangers. He walked down the hallway, past closed doors and empty workstations, feeling eyes on him even though the room was empty. The fear that had been building up inside him all day now filled him completely. He reached the locker room, collapsed on the bench, and stared at his hands. They were shaking. He couldn't control it. His mind was consumed with what had happened. The old man, Walker, the new boss. He hadn't just seen weakness and fear in him, he had exposed it, laid it bare for all to see. The crowd outside, the lieutenant, the entire department would now know that Cross wasn't who he thought he was. He wasn't strong, not some invincible defender of the law. He was a man caught in a lie, caught in his own prejudices. Ray reached for his phone. He wanted to call someone, to get some support, but he stopped. Who could he call? Coworkers? The same people who would now whisper behind his back? Family? He hadn't had a close relationship in a long time, and those he had always kept their distance because of his fiery temper. He had no one to turn to. He turned off the phone and threw it on the bench. Walker's voice echoed in his head. You can walk away from here and pretend nothing happened, but that won't erase what you did. The words were simple, but they cut like a knife, repeated over and over. Ray wanted to reject them, wanted to convince himself that it had all been an exaggeration, that he was just doing his job. But he knew it was a lie he could no longer believe. He remembered the faces in the crowd, the condemnation in their eyes. No one supported him. Even those who had always found excuses for police brutality before turned their backs on him this time. Something about that moment was too obvious. Too obvious. Even he couldn't deny it. When Ray rose from the bench and looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. It was not the face of an officer, but of a man with no way out. He reached for his uniform, but his hand froze. Putting it on now felt wrong. It no longer represented power, but a reminder of how he had used it for his own gain. He walked out of the locker room and headed for the exit. The attendant glanced at him briefly, but said nothing. Ray felt like even that brief moment of contact was leaving a mark on him. He no longer felt like he belonged in this place. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and damp. He got into his car but didn't start the engine. He had nowhere to go. He wouldn't find answers at home, and returning to the scene would only make things worse. He spent several minutes staring into space before he realized he was isolated, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. Everyone who had ever supported him was now on the other side. He remembered Walker's words about justice. Ray had always thought of himself as the enforcer of it, the defender of the law, but now he realized he had no right to even utter that word. When he had snatched the cane from the old man's hands, he had not defended the law. He had defended his hatred, his fears, and now he was the one that same law was supposed to correct. Ray felt his fear turn to despair. He wanted to do something to make things right, but he knew it was impossible. Words wouldn't bring back respect. Actions wouldn't erase his past mistakes. He felt like he was trapped in a cage he'd built, and the key was lost. But deep inside him, a new feeling began to form. It was faint, barely noticeable, but real. It was the realization that maybe he could still change something. Not everything, not right away, but at least try. He couldn't erase what he had done, but he could start by admitting his guilt. He could show that he wanted to be better, even if no one believed him right away. The thought was terrifying because it required something he had never done before. Be weak. Admit his mistakes. But it was also the only thing that gave him hope. Ray started the engine and headed home, deciding that tomorrow he would start a new day by trying to find something he had long lost, self-respect. Chapter 10. The Path to Redemption. The sun rose on the horizon the next day, but its light brought no warmth to Ray Cross. He spent the night awake, tormented by the weight of his actions. Walker's words and the disapproving looks of the crowd haunted him. He wished it was just a nightmare, but the reality was unforgiving. Today he had to go back to the station, where everyone knew what he had done. Everyone knew what he had become. Ray walked over to the bathroom mirror and looked at his reflection. His face was tired, haggard. It was the face of a man who had hidden behind a badge for too long, using it as a cover for his fears. He knew it was time to stop hiding. Today he had to face his mistakes, even if it meant completely destroying his reputation. The atmosphere in the station was strange. Colleagues who usually greeted him with nods or short phrases now looked away. Some whispered about him behind his back. Others simply ignored him. It was humiliating, but Ray knew he deserved it. He walked down the hallway, feeling each step become heavier. His final destination was the office of his boss, Walker. The door was ajar. Ray knocked, then walked in, trying to look collected, but his hands were shaking. "Officer Cross," Walker said, looking up from the papers on his desk. His voice was calm, but there was a stern justice to it. "What brings you here?" Ray stood there hesitantly, but then he sighed and spoke. "I came to apologize, sir, for everything, for the way I treated you, for my behavior, and for representing this department in the way I did. I have no excuses." Walker looked at him carefully. His gaze was not judgmental, but rather scrutinizing. He was looking for something in this man: sincerity, remorse. "You realize that a simple apology is not enough?" Walker finally asked. "An apology is a start. But what are you going to do next?" Ray lowered his head, considering his words. Then he looked up, his gaze full of determination. "I want to be a better person, sir. I want to fix what I did. I know it won't change my past, but I can change my future, and if that means starting from the ground up, I'm ready." Walker leaned forward, leaning on his cane, his eyes a mixture of sternness and mild approval. "Being better isn't just words, officer. It's actions. It's a choice you make every day. And if you really want to change things, you're going to have to face some uncomfortable truths about yourself and the system you represent." Ray nodded. He knew this path would be difficult. He would have to face the judgment of his peers, the distrust of citizens, and even his own inner demons. But he also knew that this was the only way forward. "What should I do?" he asked. Walker was silent for a moment, then stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the bustling city street, then turned back to Ray. "Start by learning. Really learning. Learn about the people you are supposed to protect, not through your prejudices, but through their stories, their reality. Go to places you have never gone, talk to people you have never listened to. And don't think it will be easy. You will be judged, you will be tested. But if you are sincere, you can take the first step toward redemption." Ray felt a strange feeling wash over him. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't relief. It was hope, but with a hint of heaviness. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it made sense. "I will do it," he said firmly. "I promise." Walker nodded, his gaze softening. "Good. Show it with your actions, not with words." Ray walked out of the office, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten a little. He knew there would be hardships ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. It was raining again outside, but this rain felt cleansing. Ray lifted his head to the sky, letting the rain run down his face, washing away the remnants of the past. He realized that justice is not a badge, a uniform, or a weapon. It is a choice. And today, he took the first step toward becoming a person worthy of being part of that choice. Chapter 11. The hardness of the first step. Rain pounded the roof of the precinct, following Raycross's footsteps as he walked out of the building. The streets that had once seemed familiar to him now seemed foreign, filled with new meaning. Every passerby, every glance he caught, reminded him of who he was and what kind of man he was meant to be. He walked along the wet sidewalk, listening to the sound of his own footsteps, thinking about Walker's words. It felt as if the world he knew so well had changed overnight. It was both frightening and reassuring. He knew that changing his life would be harder than it had seemed in the chief's office, but it was strangely liberating to feel that he was at least trying. Cross stopped at a small cafe on the corner of the street. It was one of the places where he often ordered coffee before his shift, but now he hesitated before going in. It was warm inside. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. People were sitting at tables, talking, laughing. He saw someone glance at him, briefly but full of judgment. It was the man he had once rudely stopped on the street, without bothering to apologize. Now that look haunted him. Ray walked up to the counter, ordered a coffee, and sat in the corner, trying not to attract attention. He felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was a text from a colleague. "Everyone is talking about what you did. Better hold on. Walker is determined to make a difference, and you are now his first example." Ray's heart sank. He knew that his mistakes would be used as a tool for Walker to restore order in the department. His behavior was no longer just his own burden, but a symbol for everyone else. He knew his colleagues would look at him with either contempt or pity. This was a new reality he had to accept. By the time he finished his coffee and walked out of the cafe, the rain had stopped. The air was crisp, the streets were glistening with moisture, but the storm was still raging inside him. He realized he couldn't go home without taking the first real step. He pulled out his phone, opened his address book, and found the number for a local community center he'd heard of but never paid attention to. An hour later, he was standing in front of a small building with peeling paint on the doors. The sign read, Center for Social Support and Equality. It was quiet but cozy inside. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes sat at the reception desk, and they narrowed slightly when she saw Ray's uniform. "How can I help you?" she asked, trying to hide her suspicion. Ray swallowed, feeling his throat go dry. He collected his thoughts and said, "I'm Officer Cross. I'm here to see what I can do to help. I want to see how I can change my attitude and help people." Her eyebrows rose slightly. She hadn't expected such a statement, especially from a police officer, but she seemed to sense the sincerity in his words. She pointed him toward the door to the small room where the meeting was taking place. The room was filled with people, men and women of all ages and races. They listened intently to a young woman who was telling the story of her life, of how she had been unfairly arrested, of how she had been humiliated simply because of the color of her skin. Each story she told was a blow to Ray. He could hear in her voice the same anger and pain that Walker had expressed to him the day before. It was familiar, but he listened differently now. When the woman finished, everyone turned their attention to Ray. He felt their gazes like spotlights, illuminating his every weakness. He began, but his voice wavered. He cleared his throat and continued, "I'm a police officer. And I'm here because I want to understand. I know I've made mistakes, and I want to fix them. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to be better." There was silence in the room. Some looked at him with suspicion, some with curiosity, but no one turned away. For Ray, it was the first sign of hope. Day after day, Ray returned to this center. He listened to stories, helped at volunteer events, learned about people he had previously simply ignored. He began to see the world differently. It was a world full of pain, but also hope. Every step was difficult. Every day he faced distrust, but he continued. Walker monitored his progress in the department. He didn't interfere, didn't judge, but his presence was always felt. Cross knew that his success or failure would be an example to others. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes anymore. Months later, as Ray was walking down the street, he met the same girl from the center who had once told him about her experience. She stopped, looked at him, then smiled and said, "You're not who I expected. Thank you for trying." These words were small, but to Ray they meant everything. He realized that justice is not an instant result, but an ongoing process, and he was finally on the right path. Chapter 12. Instead of rage, light days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. For Ray Cross, every new day was a challenge. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of his past mistakes, as if it were not just clothing but a reminder that he had once used it as a symbol of power, not service. People looked at him differently than they had before, some with suspicion, some with cautious hope, but none with the same respect. That respect had to be earned, and he knew it. Ray began working with the local Equality Center in earnest. He not only listened to their stories, but also actively participated in their lives. Meeting people he had previously thought of as statistics or suspects was a revelation. He saw the pain in their eyes, heard the weariness and fear in their voices, and realized that these were the very people he was supposed to protect. He realized that he had not only failed them, but had become part of the system that was causing them pain. One evening, he decided to patrol the city's most problematic areas, but this time not as a warden, but as a protector. The streets were dark, barely lit by old streetlights. Cross walked, trying not to attract unnecessary attention, but his presence was still felt. He noticed a group of teenagers who were looking at him with concern, seemingly preparing to run away. He slowed down, raised his hands to show that he was not going to pursue them, and said hello. One of them, a tall guy with a keen gaze, stepped forward, asking with obvious hostility, "What do you want here? To show who's boss again?" Ray took a deep breath. The words hit him hard, but he knew he deserved them. "No," he answered calmly. "I'm here to make sure you're safe. That's all." The boy grinned incredulously, but said nothing. The others simply watched them from the shadows. It was a small achievement, but for Ray, even silent distrust was better than open hostility. He continued on his way, leaving them behind, but secretly hoping that one day his words would be taken differently. Every day was a battle to change not only his image, but himself. Walker watched with interest but did not interfere. The new boss knew that genuine change could only happen when a person wanted it. He saw Ray increasingly attending community meetings, volunteering, sincerely trying to be part of a community he had once perceived as hostile. The day came when a letter arrived at the station. It was addressed to Walker personally, but it was about Ray. It was a thank you from one of the women whom Ray had supported in a difficult moment, resolving a conflict with her landlord, who was threatening to evict her. In the letter, the woman wrote that she did not expect help from the police, but Cross became an unexpected exception for her. These words touched Walker, but he did not pass the letter on to Ray. He only watched as Ray continued to work, as if he knew that such words were the best motivator for him. Ray began to talk more often with the young officers. He shared his experiences, his mistakes, without trying to hide the past. He told how easy it is to lose touch with reality, how a badge can turn into a weapon instead of a tool for help. Some listened with disbelief, but many thought about it. For some of them, this was the beginning of the realization that serving is not about ordering, but about protecting. Several months passed when, at a meeting at the Equality Center, Walker suddenly showed up in person. He walked into the room where people were discussing their experiences and sat in a corner, unnoticed. When the meeting ended, he stood up and addressed the crowd. "I would like to say that changes in the system are possible only when people change. We see that this process is long and painful, but possible. Today there is a person here who started this path and continues it. I am talking about Officer Cross." Ray froze. All eyes turned to him, but this time he didn't feel judgment. They were expectant looks. He stood up, feeling the weight of Walker's words settle on his shoulders. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice shaking a little. "I'm a man who's made too many mistakes, but I'm trying, every day. And I'm grateful to you for giving me a chance to prove that I can be better." There was a rare but heartfelt round of applause. It was a small step, but for Ray, it was a giant leap. He realized that the path to redemption was not an end goal, but an endless process. Every day demanded effort from him, but every day gave him hope that he could be part of the good and justice he had once sworn to serve. Chapter 13. Step by Step. Several years passed. That morning, when Ray Cross first walked into the Equality Center, seemed distant, almost unreal. He remembered himself as a man who was sure he was right, who saw the world through the prism of power and prejudice. Back then, he had believed that his role as a police officer was to control. Now he knew that control was just fear hidden behind a badge, and that real power lay in the ability to listen, learn, and protect. His name still stirred up conflicting feelings in the city. There were those who did not believe in his change, who expected him to break down, that his efforts were nothing more than an attempt to cover his tracks. But there were also those who saw his sincerity, who felt that he had truly changed. He became a symbol of the fact that change is possible even in the most difficult circumstances, if there is a desire and a willingness to admit one's mistakes. His work at the Equality Center hadn't stopped, despite the years since his first visit. He became one of the mentors for new officers who came to learn about the real life outside the police station. He told them about his struggles, how easy it was to get lost in your own power, how important it was to see the people behind the statistics. These were difficult conversations. Some listened with interest, others with doubt. But Ray didn't give up. He knew that if his story changed even one life, it would mean it had all been worth it. One day, a girl who had told a meeting about her humiliation a few years earlier approached him. She looked different. Her gaze was no longer filled with fear. Her posture was straight. She said to him, "You promised to be better then. And you know, I think you did. Not perfectly, but enough to give others hope." Those words touched Ray more deeply than he could have expected. It was a sign that his efforts were actually making a difference. He knew that all of this was the result of the small steps he took every day. He knew he could never fully atone for what he had done, but he could continue to fight to be a person worthy of respect. Policing had changed too. Walker, now chief of the department, made reform his mission. He demanded that officers not just follow the law, but understand it. He trained them not only in standard procedures, but also in ethics, community engagement, and respect for every person, regardless of their background. It wasn't easy. Many resisted, but Ray became an example that change was possible, and his experience helped Walker in his work. One day, Walker invited Ray into his office. It was their first face-to-face meeting since Ray had come to apologize. Walker sat at his desk, stern as ever, but there was something softer in his eyes than usual. "Cross," he began, "I want to thank you for proving that people can change. You were an example to me and to the department that redemption is possible, but more importantly, you were an example to yourself." Ray felt his throat tighten. They were simple words, but they meant everything to him. He knew he had made many mistakes, but this was an admission that his efforts had not been in vain. Later that day, he walked out onto the streets again. They no longer seemed hostile to him. He knew the people who lived there, knew their stories, their pain, and their joys. As he passed a group of teenagers, one of them nodded at him. It was the same boy who had once looked at him with distrust. Now there was a mixture of respect and recognition in his eyes. Ray smiled back and continued on his way. He knew there was more work to do. He knew there would always be those who doubted his sincerity. But that no longer frightened him. He had stopped looking for confirmation in the opinions of others. He knew the truth was in his actions, and that was enough. As the sun began to set, bathing the city in golden light, Ray paused at the crossroads. He remembered the moment he had first met Walker, remembered his anger and fear, remembered how he had lost control. Now he knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of his journey to redemption. He stood there, surrounded by the sounds of the city, and for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. Not confidence, not pride, but peace. He knew he had made the right choice, and he knew he would continue on this path until the very end. Chapter 14: Consequences and Redemption. Raycross knew the past didn't let go easily. His mistakes, no matter how sincere his attempts to correct them, still followed him. Every day he faced the consequences of his old life, the distrustful looks, the subtle whispers of his colleagues, the tension in his interactions with citizens. But today was different. Today, the past came to him not as a memory, but as a specific event that threatened to destroy everything he had achieved. When Ray walked into the station that morning, he noticed that the atmosphere was strangely tense. His colleagues were speaking more quietly than usual, and many fell silent as he passed. This wasn't new to him, but this time there was more than just distrust in their eyes. There was fear. He learned from the desk clerk that it was because of a video that had suddenly begun circulating online. It had captured the very moments of his confrontation with Walker on the street, before he knew who he was. The footage showed Ray as he was then, full of rage, belittling a man simply because of the color of his skin. The crowd that had watched him that day now witnessed it all over again, but through their phones and computers. The video spread quickly, accompanied by headlines condemning his behavior. Ray felt his world crumble around him. Everything he had built over the past years, all his efforts to become a better person, seemed like they could be destroyed by one memory of his past. He locked himself in his office, feeling fear creeping up on him. He knew Walker had seen the video too. How would his boss react? Would he support him, or would he think Ray wasn't worthy of being part of the team anymore? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was Walker himself. His presence always left Ray with mixed feelings, respect, and an internal struggle with his own shortcomings. "Cross," Walker began, walking in and closing the door behind him. "I saw the video, and I understand how you feel." Ray looked up, expecting condemnation, but instead saw understanding and firmness in his boss's eyes. "I can't change what people think of you now," Walker continued, "but I can tell you this. This isn't the end. The video shows who you were, but those who know you today see who you've become. You can't escape your past, but you can make it part of your story, part of your journey to redemption." Walker's words touched Ray, but the fear still lingered. He knew he had to do more than just hope people would understand. He had to take responsibility for himself. That evening, he walked into a meeting hosted by the Equality Center. The room was full of people, many of whom had seen the video. Their eyes were full of expectation, some hoping to hear him explain, some wanting to see him fail. Ray stood there, feeling the weight of every gaze, but he knew he couldn't hide any longer. "You all saw that video," he began. His voice cracked, but he continued. "It's true. It's me. And it was the worst moment of my life. I was filled with hatred, anger, fear. I saw people as threats instead of people I was supposed to protect. I was not the kind of person a police officer should be. But that's not the end of my story. I'm standing here because I want to be better. I want you to know that I don't forget what I did, and that I work every day to be the kind of person you can trust." The room froze. For a moment there was silence that seemed endless. Then one of the women present at the meeting stood up and said, "People can change. I've seen it. I saw this man come here a few years ago. He listened to our stories, helped us even when we didn't believe him. It doesn't change his mistakes, but it shows that he can do better." Gradually, applause began to ripple through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. It was recognition that Ray had really tried, that his efforts were visible. He felt the weight on his soul shift a little. The next day, a letter arrived at the station. It was addressed not only to Ray, but to the entire department. It said that the man he had humiliated on the street had become his strictest teacher. The letter was signed by Walker. In it, he wrote, "Mistakes make us human, but our desire to correct them makes us worthy of that title." I saw Ray Cross, whom I met that day, transform. He not only admitted his guilt, but dedicated his life to being a better person. This is a lesson for us all. Cruelty and hatred will always be punished, but sincerity and the desire for justice can heal. The words spread throughout the city, and while not everyone accepted them, many began to see Ray not as a symbol of hatred, but as an example of change. He continued on his journey, knowing it was never over. Every day, he proved that justice and kindness were not just words, but actions. And while his past would always be with him, it no longer defined him. It was just part of a story about how a person can overcome themselves to become a better person. If you liked this story or it made you think, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or seen injustice in your life? It is very important for us to know how you feel about such situations and what you think about it. Your stories, your experiences are what help us understand each other better and become closer. Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we sincerely appreciate your time, attention, and desire to share your thoughts. If this story touched you or made you look at something from a different angle, do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel. This helps us to continue to create content that matters. We thank you for being with us. Please do not forget that kindness and understanding begin with each of us. We wish you a good day, full of light and warmth.